I never expected my wife to be home that early, and judging by the way she froze in the doorway, she never expected to see me either, at least not like this. The sound of her keys slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the floor was the only thing that broke the silence between us, a silence so thick that for a moment, I thought it might strangle me. She stood there, still in her work clothes, her coat hanging off one shoulder, her purse slipping down her arm as her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her eyes darted from me to the coffee table in front of me, where the manila envelope sat like a bomb waiting to go off. She knew. She didn't know how much I knew, but she knew enough to be terrified. "James, what's this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though we both knew the answer already. I didn't say a word. Instead, I reached forward slow and deliberate and slid the envelope across the glass surface of the coffee table. It made a soft scraping sound, nothing dramatic, but in that moment, it might as well have been a gunshot. My fingers twitched as I let go of it, resisting the urge to crush it in my fist or throw it at her feet. "Open it," I said, my voice steady, but only because I had spent the last 24 hours making sure it would be. She hesitated. Then, with trembling hands, she took a step forward, then another, until she was standing over the coffee table, staring down at the envelope like it might explode the second she touched it. When she finally picked it up and pulled out the thick stack of papers inside, I watched her face carefully. I wanted to see the exact moment she realized there was no way out of this. Her eyes scanned the first few pages, her lips moving slightly as she read the words that spelled out the end of everything she had taken for granted. Photographs, bank statements, hotel receipts, and, of course, the messages. Hundreds of them, printed out in crisp black and white. Conversations that she probably thought had disappeared the moment she hit delete. She had underestimated me. Her breath hitched, and for the first time, she looked up at me, her eyes wide, her face pale. "James, this isn't." I leaned back against the couch, crossing my arms over my chest, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Don't." I cut her off, shaking my head. "Don't even try. You know exactly what that is, and you know exactly what you've done." Her hands gripped the papers so tightly that the edges curled. I could see her brain scrambling, flipping through excuses, justifications, maybe even a desperate attempt to play the victim. But none of it would work. Not this time. "James, please, let me explain." I let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound of it bitter even to my own ears. "Explain what, Emily? Explain why you've been fucking some guy behind my back for the last 6 months? Explain why our marriage, the life we built together, wasn't enough for you." She flinched at my words, her fingers tightening around the stack of evidence. But she still had the audacity to shake her head like she was the one who had been wronged. "It wasn't like that," she whispered. "Then tell me," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "What was it like? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty goddamn simple." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. Maybe once, I would have cared, would have softened to the sight of her crying, but not anymore. Now all I felt was a slow, simmering rage that had been building for months, finally reaching its boiling point. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, and it was almost laughable. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "You didn't just hurt me, Emily. You fucking destroyed me." She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but then for the first time since she walked through that door, she finally seemed to realize that there was nothing she could say to fix this. The weight of it settled over her, and for a moment, she just stood there, holding onto those papers like they were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, looking her dead in the eye. "So, tell me, Emily," I said, my voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "What do we do now?" She didn't have an answer, and that was exactly what I expected. Emily stood there gripping the stack of papers so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her whole body tense, as if she was bracing for a physical blow. I watched as her eyes darted across the pages, scanning through the damning evidence that laid out her betrayal in black and white. There was no way to twist it, no way to pretend that this was anything other than what it was. She had been unfaithful, and now she had to face the consequences. I swear to God, James, it's not what you think, she finally said, her voice uneven, barely holding back the panic that threatened to creep in. Please, if you just let me explain, I cut her off with a sharp shake of my head, my patience already worn thin. Explain what? That you weren't actually meeting up with him in that hotel room? That you weren't sending him those messages about how much you missed his hands on you? I leaned forward slightly, my gaze never leaving hers, daring her to keep lying to me. Tell me, Emily, which part of this is not what I think? Because unless I'm some kind of idiot who can't read plain English, it looks exactly like what it is. She swallowed hard, her throat working as she tried to force out words that wouldn't come. There was no explanation, no excuse that could make this go away. But still, she had the nerve to stand there and act like this was something we could just talk through, like she hadn't completely shattered everything we built over the years. I made a mistake, she whispered, her voice cracking, her eyes desperate as they searched my face for any sign of mercy. I let out a breath, slow and controlled, keeping my anger on a tight leash. A mistake, I repeated, my tone flat. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill or saying something stupid during an argument. What you did, Emily, that wasn't a mistake. That was a decision. A conscious, repeated, deliberate decision. Don't insult me by pretending it was anything else. Her mouth opened and closed again, her breathing unsteady as the reality of her situation settled in. She looked down at the papers in her hands, as if seeing them for the first time, as if only now realizing that there was no erasing what she had done. James, I swear, I never wanted to hurt you, she tried again, her voice softer now, pleading. I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides, the weight of her words pressing down on me in a way that made my stomach churn. You didn't care if you hurt me, I said, my voice quiet but firm. If you had, you wouldn't have done this. You didn't give a damn about me when you were with him. So don't stand there and pretend like this is some tragic accident that just happened to you. She flinched like I had slapped her, her face crumbling for a brief moment before she pulled herself together, her breath shaky as she stepped forward. I love you, she whispered. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it, and I shook my head, the sheer audacity of her words hitting me harder than anything else. You love me, I repeated, my voice filled with disbelief. You love me so much that you let another man touch you, sleep with you, take what was supposed to be mine? Is that what love looks like to you? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she reached out toward me, but I took a step back, the instinctive recoil so strong it felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't want her touching me. I didn't want her anywhere near me. Please, James, she begged, her voice cracking under the weight of her own guilt. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but we can fix this. We can. You don't get to decide that. I cut her off sharply. You lost the right to talk about we the second you chose him. Her whole body trembled, her arms wrapping around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. For a moment, I thought she might collapse right there in front of me, but she didn't. She just stood there, staring at me like she couldn't believe this was really happening. Like she thought there was some way she could undo it all. Does he know I know? I asked suddenly, my voice colder now, more calculated. Her breath hitched, and she hesitated just a fraction of a second too long before shaking her head. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly, my mind working through the possibilities. Good, I said. She blinked at me, confused. What do you mean, good? I leaned back against the couch again, my arms crossed over my chest, my expression unreadable. It means I still have time to decide how I want to handle this, I said. And trust me, Emily, I'm going to handle it. Panic flashed across her face, and she took a shaky step forward. James, please, just let me. I think you should leave. I interrupted, my tone final. Her eyes widened. What? No, James, please. We need to talk about this. We can. I don't want to talk to you right now, I said, my voice firm, my jaw tight. I don't even want to look at you. Get your things and go. Tears spilled down her cheeks now, but I didn't care. She had spent months lying to my face, sneaking around behind my back, making a fool out of me. I had given her my loyalty, my trust, my love, and she had thrown it away like it was nothing. James, please, she choked out, but I was already standing up, already walking past her toward the door. "I'll send you a message when I'm ready to talk," I said, opening it and gesturing for her to leave. "Until then, stay somewhere else." She stared at me, her lips trembling, her body frozen in place. I didn't say another word. I just waited. And after what felt like an eternity, she finally moved. She wiped at her face, turned, and walked out the door without another word. As soon as she was gone, I exhaled slowly, my hands gripping the edge of the table so hard that my knuckles ached. The house was quiet now, too quiet, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the full weight of what had just happened. But this wasn't the end. Not even close. I was going to make sure of that. The silence in the house was suffocating after Emily left. I sat there for a long time, staring at the pile of evidence on the table, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The anger hadn't faded, but something colder had settled in. A sense of purpose, a need for control. She thought she could just cry her way out of this, beg for another chance, act like she hadn't spent months making a fool out of me. But I wasn't going to let this slide. Not after everything she had done. The question now was how far I was willing to go. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped at a name I hadn't called in a while. Kevin, my best friend since college, the guy who had been through everything with me. He was the kind of person who never asked unnecessary questions, who just showed up when you needed him. I hit the call button, and after 2 rings, he picked up. "James," he said, his voice casual, like we had just spoken yesterday instead of weeks ago. "What's up, man?" I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. "I need you to come over," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. There was a brief pause, then a shift in his tone. "You good?" "No," I admitted, glancing at the empty doorway where Emily had just walked out. "Not even close." "Be there in 15, he said without hesitation, and then the line went dead. True to his word, Kevin showed up exactly 15 minutes later, knocking twice before letting himself in like he always did. He took one look at me, then at the stack of papers on the table, and his expression hardened. He didn't need to ask what was going on. He just knew. "Tell me everything," he said, dropping onto the couch across from me. So I did. I laid it all out. How I had suspected something was off, how I had gathered the proof, how I had confronted Emily and watched her crumble under the weight of her own lies. I didn't sugarcoat anything, didn't hold back on the parts that made me feel pathetic, like the fact that I'd spent weeks doubting myself, thinking maybe I was paranoid. Kevin listened without interrupting, his face unreadable as he flipped through the evidence, taking in the details that had torn my marriage apart. When I was done, he set the papers down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You want to wreck this guy, or just walk away?" he asked, his voice calm, like we were discussing plans for the weekend instead of the destruction of a relationship. I let out a breath, my hands clenching into fists. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I know I'm not letting them walk away from this like nothing happened." Kevin nodded like he expected that answer. "Then we start with the basics," he said, pulling out his own phone. "Who is he?" I gave him the name. Daniel Carter. I had barely let myself say it out loud before, but now it felt necessary. He was a real person, not just some faceless mistake. He was the one she had chosen over me. Kevin's fingers moved quickly over his screen, and within seconds, he was scrolling through something, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I knew that name sounded familiar," he muttered. I frowned. "You know him?" "Not personally," Kevin said, flipping his phone around to show me his social media profile. "But I've seen him before. He's married." My stomach twisted. "What?" Kevin nodded, scrolling through the guy's photos, stopping on a picture of him standing next to a woman, smiling at the camera like he wasn't a lying piece of garbage. "Her name's Lauren," he said. "They've been together for a while. No kids, but they got married 3 years ago." I stared at the screen, barely processing what I was seeing. All this time, I've been thinking about what Emily had done to me, about how she had thrown away our life together for this guy. But now, another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. It wasn't just my life that had been ruined. His wife had no idea either. Kevin leaned back, watching me carefully. "So, what do you want to do with that information?" I exhaled slowly, my mind racing. "I want her to know," I said, my voice firm. "She deserves to know." Kevin nodded approvingly. Then let's make it happen. It didn't take long to find her contact information. A quick search pulled up a business website where she was listed as a marketing consultant, her email and office number right there for anyone to see. Kevin raised an eyebrow at me, silently asking if I was sure. I didn't hesitate. I picked up my phone, dialed the number, and waited. A few rings later, a woman's voice answered. Lauren Carter speaking. I gripped the phone tighter, steadying myself. Lauren, my name is James, and I think we need to talk about your husband. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a hesitant, "Excuse me?" I glanced at Kevin, who gave me a small nod of encouragement. "I don't want to do this over the phone," I said, keeping my tone calm. "But I have proof that Daniel has been having an affair with my wife." The silence stretched between us, thick with tension. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but there was an edge to it. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," I said. "I can send you the proof if you want, or we can meet in person. Your choice." There was another pause, then a sharp breath on the other end. "Send me what you have," she said, her voice tight. I didn't waste time. I forwarded her the messages, the photos, the receipts, everything I had spent weeks gathering. I imagined her sitting there, staring at her phone, feeling the same sickening disbelief that had hit me when I first uncovered the truth. A minute passed, then another. When she finally responded, her words were simple. "Where can we meet?" I looked at Kevin, who was already pulling up locations on his phone. "Somewhere neutral," he muttered. "Public enough to be safe, but private enough to talk." I relayed a nearby coffee shop, one that wasn't too crowded in the evenings. Lauren agreed and hung up without another word. Kevin leaned back, exhaling. "Well," he said, "this just got a hell of a lot more interesting." I ran a hand down my face, the weight of everything sinking in. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not even close. The coffee shop was quiet when I walked in, the kind of place where people came to work or have hushed conversations over overpriced drinks. I spotted Lauren immediately, sitting at a corner table with her back straight and her hands wrapped tightly around a cup that she hadn't touched. Her face was unreadable, but the way her jaw was clenched told me everything I needed to know. She had seen the proof. She wasn't here for confirmation. She was here for the next step. I walked over, pulling out the chair across from her, and she barely looked up as I sat down. Kevin had offered to come, but this wasn't his fight. This was between me and her, two people who had been living in ignorance while our spouses played their little game behind our backs. She finally spoke, her voice flat, controlled. "How long?" I exhaled slowly, resting my hands on the table. 6 months, maybe longer, I said, watching as her grip tightened on the cup. "I started noticing things a while ago, but I only got proof recently." She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head slightly as she stared at the table. "I feel like an idiot," she muttered. "I should have known. He started coming home late, always had some excuse about work. But he was careful, never anything obvious. I thought he was tired." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Same here," I admitted. Emily had been distant, but I kept convincing myself it was just stress, that we were in a rough patch. Turns out the only thing rough was how stupid I was for not seeing it sooner. She finally looked up at me then, her eyes sharp, filled with something that wasn't sadness anymore. "So what now?" she asked. "You called me. You showed me the proof. Are you just here to compare notes? Or do you actually want to do something about it?" I studied her for a moment, taking in the way she was holding herself together despite everything crashing down around her. She wasn't here to cry or beg for answers. She was here because she wanted to hit back, just like I did. "I want them to feel it," I said, my voice low but firm. "I don't want them to walk away from this like it was just a bad decision they can move past. They made a choice, and now they need to deal with the consequences." A slow, humorless smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Good," she said, because I was thinking the same thing. We spent the next hour laying everything out, piecing together the timeline, cross-referencing stories. It was almost clinical, the way we dissected their lies, pinpointing exactly when they must have started sneaking around, which business trips had been real, and which had just been excuses to be together. The more we talked, the more the rage in my chest solidified into something colder, more deliberate. Lauren was the one who suggested the next step. "We need to confront them at the same time," she said, her fingers drumming against the table. They've had the luxury of controlling the situation, of deciding when and how they wanted to do this. We take that from them. We pull the rug out from under their feet. I nodded slowly, considering the idea. "How do you want to do it?" She leaned forward, her expression set in stone. "Public," she said. "Somewhere they won't be able to make a scene. Somewhere they'll have no choice but to sit there and take it." It didn't take long to come up with the perfect place. A high-end restaurant, one that required reservations and catered to a crowd that valued appearances over everything else. It was the kind of place where people measured their worth by how put together they seemed, where a scandal wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be humiliating. I made the reservation under my name, ensuring that Daniel and Emily would be seated before we arrived. They wouldn't suspect a thing. They would think it was just another night out, another secret rendezvous that they had gotten away with. Lauren and I arrived exactly 15 minutes after them, walking in side by side, our expressions unreadable. The hostess barely glanced at us before leading us to the table where our cheating spouses sat, laughing softly, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. The second Emily looked up and saw me, the color drained from her face. Daniel turned next, confusion flickering across his features before realization dawned, his jaw tightening as he sat up straighter. Lauren was the first to speak. "Don't get up," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "We wouldn't want to cause a scene, would we?" Emily opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I pulled out a chair, sat down across from her, and placed the stack of papers on the table between us. "Go ahead," I said, my voice calm. "Explain this." Daniel's hands clenched into fists on the table. "James, listen, this isn't—" "Shut up," Lauren cut in, her voice cold. "You don't get to talk right now." The restaurant was quiet, the low hum of conversation around us barely registering as I watched Emily struggle for words. She had spent months lying to me, but now, with everything out in the open, she couldn't even muster up a single excuse. "How long?" I asked, repeating Lauren's question from earlier, my gaze locked onto Emily. She swallowed hard, glancing at Daniel as if hoping he had an answer for her. When he said nothing, she turned back to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "It had just happened." Lauren scoffed, shaking her head. "That's the best you can come up with," she said. "After months of sneaking around, of lying to our faces, that's what you're going with." Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "What do you want us to say?" he muttered. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so only they could hear. "I want you to feel what we felt," I said. "I want you to sit there and realize that you've lost everything." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not sadness. Just a quiet satisfaction as I watched her fall apart. Lauren stood first, pushing her chair back. "Enjoy your meal," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I hope it was worth it." I followed her lead, turning away without another word. As we walked out of the restaurant, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift, replaced by something else. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a start. Lauren and I walked out of the restaurant without looking back, stepping onto the sidewalk where the evening air felt strangely lighter. Neither of us spoke at first, both processing what had just happened. The plan had been executed perfectly. There was no shouting match, no unnecessary dramatics. Just the cold, hard truth laid out in a place where they couldn't run from it. The expressions on their faces were burned into my memory, the moment they realized they had lost control. I had spent weeks drowning in confusion and self-doubt, wondering if I had imagined the distance, if I had been overthinking things. Now, there was no doubt left. Emily and Daniel weren't just cheaters. They were cowards, and tonight, they had been forced to sit with that fact in public, unable to spin their usual excuses. Lauren finally exhaled, her hands on her hips as she stared at the empty street in front of us. "That was satisfying," she said, more to herself than to me. Then she turned, her gaze sharp. "But I'm not done." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I'm filing for divorce first thing tomorrow," she said, her voice steady, without hesitation. Daniel doesn't get to walk away from this like it was a bad decision he can smooth over. He loses everything. His house, his stability, and whatever pathetic little fantasy he thought he was living. I nodded slowly, her words settling something inside me. Same, I said. Emily and I are done. No second chances, no drawn-out discussions. She made her choice, and now she can live with it. Lauren studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod of approval. Good, she said. I don't know about you, but I'm not the type to play the role of the devastated, heartbroken spouse. I'll grieve later. Right now, I want them to feel the weight of their own actions. I thought about Emily, about how she had looked at me across that table, her eyes full of guilt, but not regret. She was sorry she got caught, sorry that she no longer had the option to keep me on the hook while she played around behind my back. But true remorse? I didn't see it, and I had no intention of wasting my time waiting for it to appear. Lauren checked her phone, then sighed. I need to get back home, she said. I have to start making arrangements. But listen, James. She hesitated for the first time all night, then continued. If you need anything, legal help, advice, even just someone to talk to, you have my number. I know we only met because of this disaster, but at least one good thing can come out of it. I appreciated the offer more than I could say. Same goes for you, I said. We didn't ask for any of this, but we don't have to go through it alone. She gave me a quick, tight smile before heading off toward her car, and I watched her go before turning in the opposite direction, my mind already racing with what needed to happen next. The confrontation was done, but there was still plenty of work to do. When I got home, I wasn't surprised to see Emily's car parked outside. I had told her to stay somewhere else, but clearly, she had other ideas. She was sitting on the couch when I walked in, her face streaked with dried tears, her hands gripping the fabric of her sweater like she was trying to ground herself. James, she said, standing up immediately, her voice raw. Please, can we talk? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took off my jacket, set my keys down on the table, and met her gaze with the same cold detachment I had felt at the restaurant. There's nothing left to talk about. She flinched, her eyes welling up again, but I didn't feel anything anymore. The sadness, the anger, the betrayal. I'd already burned through all of it. Now, there was only clarity. I screwed up, she admitted, her voice shaking. I know that. But I love you, James. I love what we built together. I don't want to lose you. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. You lost me months ago, I said. You just didn't realize it until now. She took a step closer, reaching out, but I stepped back, and that seemed to hit her harder than anything else. I don't hate you, I continued. I'm not going to scream or throw things or beg for an explanation. I already got all the answers I need. You made a choice, and now I'm making mine. I'm filing for divorce. Her breath caught, and for a second, I thought she might collapse right there. James, please, she whispered, and there was something desperate in the way she said my name, like she was just now understanding that there was no fixing this. I want you gone by the end of the week, I said, my voice even. I'll have the papers drawn up. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but then, finally, she saw it. The finality in my expression, the reality of what she had done. She let out a small, broken breath and nodded. I walked past her, heading to the bedroom, and when I closed the door behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. This was over. Emily and I would never go back to what we were, and honestly, I didn't want to. She had spent 6 months lying to me, treating me like an option while I had been treating her like my priority. But not anymore. I wasn't interested in revenge, in dragging this out longer than necessary. I just wanted my life back. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was finally on my way to getting it.